Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, starting as an enforcer for the labor rackets run by Louis Lepke Buchalter, Weiss became one of the organization's most dependable assassins, taking part in several high-profile contract killings for the National Crime Syndicate. On the night of October 23, 1935, with their getaway driver Seymour Piggy Schechter parked at the curb, Weiss and Charles the Bug Workman walked into the Palace Chophouse at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey, to murder Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz, whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, made his name and fortune in bootlegging alcohol and the numbers racket. Schultz's operations were threatened by tax evasion trials led by Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. In an effort to avert his conviction, Schultz asked the commission for permission to take out Dewey. Luciano argued that a Dewey assassination would precipitate a massive law enforcement crackdown. The National Crime Syndicate had enacted a hard and fast rule, stating that law enforcement and prosecutors were not to be harmed. An enraged Schultz said he would kill Dewey anyway and stormed out of the meeting. Murder Inc. leader Albert Anastasia later approached Luciano with information that Schultz had asked him for men to stake out Dewey's Fifth Avenue apartment. Upon hearing the news, the commission held a discreet meeting to discuss the matter. After 6 hours of deliberations, the commission ordered Louis Lepke Buchalter to eliminate the Dutchman. Mendy Weiss and Charles the Bug Workman entered the back room of the Palace Chophouse on the afternoon of October 23rd. Otto Berman, Dutch Schultz's accountant, Abe Landau, his new chief lieutenant, and his personal bodyguard, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, were all wounded. Berman collapsed immediately after he was shot. Landau's carotid artery was severed by a bullet passing through his neck, and Rosenkrantz was repeatedly hit at point-blank range. Despite their injuries, both gangsters rose to their feet, returned fire, and drove the two assassins out of the restaurant. But not before Workman got to work on Schultz, making his way into the men's room, whereupon he found his target and opened fire. Weiss, fearing the arrival of the police, fled the scene and jumped into the awaiting getaway car. He ordered their driver to drive off without Workman, who was still finishing off Schultz in the restaurant's restroom. After Workman supposedly rifled through the Dutchman's pockets for cash, Landau chased them out of the restaurant and emptied his pistol at him, but missed. After Workman fled on foot, Landau finally collapsed. Bleeding profusely from the abdomen, Dutch Schultz staggered out from the men's room into the dining area, sauntered over to a table, and sank into a chair. He gasped for air, calling for anyone who could hear him to get him an ambulance. Rosenkrantz managed to get on his feet and demanded the barman, who had been hiding during the shooting, to give him some change. Rosenkrantz called for an ambulance before he lost consciousness. Charles the Bug Workman made his way to the curb in front of the Chophouse, but both Weiss and the getaway car were long gone. This left Workman the task of making it back to New York alone. The following day, workmen filed a complaint to the Board of Murder, Inc. and demanded Weiss's life for abandoning him, an offense punishable by death. Weiss's argument for leaving the scene was that the job was over. The target had been put down. It was time to split. Workmen's robbing of the dying Schultz was personal business and thereby jeopardized their escape. The commission sided with their most dependable lieutenant, Mendy Weiss. A soft-spoken, professional killer and automobile thief, Seymour Bluejaw Magoon was known as Bluejaw amongst his colleagues because of a blue burn mark on his left jaw. His ability as a driver led to him often being assigned the role of driving the getaway car after fellow gangsters committed the murder. The time was 7:55 a.m. on July 25th, 1939. 5 men in a blue sedan watched the short, fat fellow walk out of his apartment building at 250 East 178th Street in the Bronx. The man was bound for the East Tremont Avenue subway station, right on schedule. One of the men in the sedan was a Jacob Cubby Migden, a fledgling Brooklyn hoodlum who had spent a week tailing the subject. It was Cuppy's job to confirm the identity of the target. The sedan's driver, Seymour Bluejaw Magoon, dropped the big car in gear. He prowled past the quarry, did a U-turn, then approached from the rear. Murder Inc. hitman Gio Achino Dandy Jack Parisi stepped out on a running board, raised a .32 caliber pistol, and emptied it into the man's back. The problem was, they shot the wrong man. The victim was Irving Penn, a 42-year-old executive with G. Schwarmer Inc., the Manhattan classical music publisher. Penn lived a quiet, crimeless life with his wife and 2 daughters. He was rushed to a nearby hospital. With his dying breath, he whispered to a puzzled police detective, There were groans of recognition that morning when news of the murder reached the office of Thomas Dewey. Dewey was expecting a visit that very day from a former garment union boss, Philip Orlovsky. Orlovsky was informing prosecutors of Louis Lepke Buchalter's illegal activities within the unions. Orlovsky lived in the same building as Irving Penn. The 2 men looked vaguely alike, although Penn was 75 pounds heavier and wore glasses. Philip Orlovsky cheated death that day when he left home an hour early to get a barbershop shave. Louis Capone, no affiliation with Al Capone, ran a legitimate Italian-style cafe serving coffee and pastries in Brooklyn. Capone had strong connections with the Purple Gang of Detroit and was operating loan-sharking rackets in both Detroit and New York. He was also involved in labor racketeering with the local unions and had close ties with mobster Joe Adonis. The eatery became a popular hangout spot for teenagers, including future street gang leaders Abe Relis and Harry Mayone. Capone built up a rapport with the two boys by offering them free food. These young men soon became Capone's protégés in crime. With the end of the Castle Maresi War in 1931 and the formation of the National Crime Syndicate, Albert Anastasia, a patron of Capone's restaurant, persuaded the two gang leaders, Relis and Mayone, that they could make a great deal of money working together for Cosa Nostra. Anastasia would send murder contracts to mobster Louis Lepke Buchalter. Buchalter, in turn, would contact Louis Capone. Capone would then recruit the individual hitmen from the Relis and Mayone gangs. By 1934, all of the Cosa Nostra crime families were using Murder, Inc. On September 13, 1936, Mendy Weiss, along with Louis Capone, Sholem Bernstein, Philip Little Farwell Cohen, James Farraco, and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss took part in the murder of Brownsville, Brooklyn candy store owner Joseph Rosen. Buchalter had ordered the murder in order to prevent Rosen, whom Buchalter had earlier forced out of the garment trucking business, from making good on a threat to expose Buchalter and his rackets to prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Under Anastasia and Lepke's direction, Murder Incorporated operated in what could be considered stealth mode, complete secrecy to the outside world. Once the commission sanctioned a hit, Anastasia would pass the information on to Buchalter. Buchalter would relay the information to Mendy Weiss or Louis Capone, who in turn would select which hitman would be assigned the job. None of the hired gunmen had any connection with the major crime families. So if they were caught, they could not implicate their mafia employers. Harry Millman was a gangster who was gunned down in a local bar in Detroit, Michigan. Millman was a former member of Detroit's Purple Gang. Bootleggers and hijackers comprised primarily of Jewish gangsters who competed with the Italian mafia for territory in Detroit. Millman became a marked man once becoming a loose cannon within his own gang and the rival Licovoli Mafia. After several attempts to kill Millman failed, including a failed car bombing in a parking lot at the Club 1040 several months earlier, the commission intervened. A call was made to the 24-hour candy shop in Brooklyn, New York, Midnight Rose. Within days, Murder Incorporated's two most enthusiastic killers, Harry Mayone and Harry Strauss, caught a train to Detroit, Michigan. Upon arrival, the two hitmen began making preparations. Mayone and Strauss secured their vehicles, a 1937 Ford sedan, stolen plates and crash cars, selected their weapons of choice, trailed their target, selected the most ideal kill spot, and planned their escape routes. November 25th, 1937, 1 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Harry Happy Mayone and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss walked into Boesky's restaurant, a popular Motor City eatery, and sprayed the bar with bullets as Millman sat at the bar, drink in hand. 4 innocent bystanders were wounded, and though there were plenty of eyewitnesses to the murder, none could identify the 2 hitmen. Within hours, Mayone and Strauss were headed east, back to New York. Midnight Rose, an inconspicuous 24-hour coffee shop and candy store on the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenue in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Run by a little old lady in her 60s, Mrs. Rosie Gold, the coffee shop and candy store looked as unoffensive as could be. Yet, the innocuous Midnight Rose was the secret headquarters of Cosa Nostra's deadliest outfit. The atmosphere in Midnight Rose was compared to a day labor exchange. Hitmen hanging around, waiting for contract jobs to come in. These contract killers were kept on retainer by being paid a basic salary, plus freelance fees for each hit they carried out. A killer working for Buchalter could count on $1,000 to $5,000 per job, depending on the target and the expected difficulty of the hit. Some made a small fortune. For most of these hitmen, it was irrelevant whether they were working for La Cosa Nostra or Kosher Nostra. As long as they were paid well, they killed. Rosie Gold kept a wall of payphones at the back of her shop. The hitmen passed their time in Midnight Rose as best they could while waiting for work. They drank coffee, tea, or soda pops, smoked cigars, cigarettes, or blunts, played chess, poker, or blackjack, read the newspaper, all while waiting for the phone to ring with details of the next job. Though its members were involved in a variety of illicit activities, from loan sharking to prostitution, they each became infamous for their role as the National Crime Syndicate's execution squad. And though they were New York City based, their reach extended far beyond the East Coast. Murder Inc.'s reign of murder and mayhem ran unencumbered throughout the city and across the country from 1929 until 1941, when one of their own turned